My doctor prescribed me unnecessary procedures to increase his profits, so I secretly recorded our consultations and got his medical license revoked. Trust is the foundation of the doctor-patient relationship, but some physicians see patients as profit opportunities rather than people who need genuine medical care. My doctor, Dr. Raymond Clark, thought he could pressure me into expensive, unnecessary procedures to pad his practice's revenue while putting my health at risk for his financial gain. What he didn't know was that I'd been secretly recording our consultations for months, and that one comprehensive report to the medical board would destroy the career he'd built on medical fraud and patient exploitation. I'm Sarah Mitchell, 32, and I have a chronic autoimmune condition that requires regular medical monitoring and treatment. For the past 3 years, I'd been seeing Dr. Clark, a rheumatologist, with what appeared to be a successful practice in an upscale medical building in Denver. Initially, Dr. Clark seemed knowledgeable and professional, providing competent care for my condition while explaining treatment options clearly and thoroughly. But over the past year, Dr. Clark's approach to my care had changed dramatically. Instead of focusing on managing my symptoms with proven treatments, he began pushing increasingly expensive and invasive procedures that seemed unnecessary given my stable condition. The first red flag was when Dr. Clark started suggesting costly diagnostic tests that weren't indicated by my symptoms or current health status. Sarah, I think we should do a comprehensive metabolic panel, advanced inflammatory markers, and genetic testing to get a more complete picture of your condition, he said during a routine follow-up appointment. I was confused because my condition had been stable for months, and my regular lab work showed normal results across all standard measures. Dr. Clark, my symptoms haven't changed, and my last blood work looked good, I replied. Are these tests necessary for managing my current treatment? Well, we want to be proactive rather than reactive, he said with a dismissive wave. These advanced tests can detect subtle changes before they become serious problems. Prevention is always better than treatment. The tests he was recommending would cost over $3,000, even with my insurance coverage. And when I researched them later, I discovered that none were recommended by medical guidelines for patients with my condition and symptom profile. But Dr. Clark was persuasive about the supposed benefits of early detection and comprehensive monitoring, so I reluctantly agreed to some of the testing. When the results came back, all normal, as expected, Dr. Clark seemed disappointed rather than relieved. These results are within normal ranges, but I'm seeing some borderline values that concern me, he said, pointing to lab numbers that were clearly within the normal reference ranges. But, Dr. Clark, all these values are marked as normal on the report, I pointed out. Normal ranges are just statistical averages, he replied. I prefer to be more aggressive about early intervention when I see trends that might indicate future problems. That's when Dr. Clark began his campaign to convince me that I needed expensive procedures that seemed completely unrelated to my actual medical condition. He started by suggesting that I undergo arthroscopic joint surgery to prevent future joint damage, even though I had no joint symptoms, and imaging studies showed no abnormalities. Sarah, your inflammatory markers suggest that joint damage could be occurring at a microscopic level, Dr. Clark explained. Arthroscopic evaluation would allow us to directly visualize any early changes and potentially prevent serious joint destruction. I was skeptical because I had no joint pain, swelling, or limitations, and my inflammatory markers were actually improved compared to previous tests. Dr. Clark, I don't have any joint symptoms. Why would I need joint surgery when nothing is bothering me? That's exactly why this is the perfect time for intervention, he insisted. Once symptoms develop, the damage may already be irreversible. This procedure would allow us to catch problems early and potentially save your joints. The arthroscopic procedure he was recommending would cost over $15,000 and require general anesthesia, surgical risks, and weeks of recovery time, all for a preventive intervention that wasn't supported by any medical guidelines for my condition. When I asked for a second opinion, doctor, Clark became defensive and suggested that seeking other opinions showed a lack of trust in his professional judgment. Sarah, I've been treating autoimmune conditions for 15 years, he said with obvious irritation. If you don't trust my recommendations, perhaps you should find another physician who's less thorough about preventive care. The threat was clear. Accept his expensive recommendations, or find a new doctor who might not provide the same comprehensive care. But I was becoming increasingly suspicious of Dr. Clark's motivations, especially when I researched the procedures he was recommending and found that they weren't standard treatments for patients with my condition and symptom profile. That's when I decided to start secretly recording our consultations to document exactly what Dr. Clark was telling me and how he was justifying these expensive interventions. In Colorado, it's legal to record conversations as long as one party, me, consents to the recording. So I began using my phone to capture our appointments while keeping detailed notes about his recommendations and reasoning. The recorded conversations revealed a troubling pattern of Dr. Clark pushing expensive procedures by exaggerating risks, misrepresenting medical guidelines, and using fear tactics to pressure me into accepting unnecessary interventions. During one recorded consultation, Dr. Clark tried to convince me that I needed a $20,000 experimental infusion therapy that wasn't FDA approved for my condition. "Sarah, this treatment represents the cutting edge of autoimmune therapy," he said confidently. "Early adopters are seeing remarkable results, and I think you'd be an excellent candidate." "Dr. Clark, is this treatment FDA approved for my specific condition?" I asked. "Well, it's approved for related conditions, and off-label use is completely legal and often represents the most advanced care available," he replied evasively. When I researched the treatment later, I discovered that it was still in clinical trials for my condition, had significant side effects, and wasn't recommended by any medical organizations for patients with my symptom profile. Dr. Clark was essentially trying to use me as a test subject for an experimental treatment while charging me $20,000 for the privilege. But the most damaging recordings came when Dr. Clark accidentally revealed his true motivations during a consultation where he thought I was committed to his treatment recommendations. "You know, Sarah, patients like you are exactly why I got into private practice," he said while reviewing my insurance coverage. "Your insurance has excellent coverage for procedures, and you're motivated to invest in your health regardless of cost. That's the kind of patient relationship that allows me to provide really comprehensive care." He was essentially admitting that he saw me as a profitable patient whose good insurance and willingness to pay for treatments made me an ideal target for expensive procedures. The recording that sealed Dr. Clark's fate came when I pretended to be interested in his arthroscopic recommendation and asked him to explain the medical necessity in detail. "Dr. Clark, can you show me the specific guidelines that recommend arthroscopic surgery for patients with my condition and lab results?" I asked. "Well, guidelines are written by committees and tend to be conservative," he said dismissively. "Experienced physicians often need to go beyond standard recommendations to provide optimal care." "So this procedure isn't actually recommended by medical guidelines for my situation?" "Guidelines are just suggestions, Sarah. My 15 years of experience treating patients like you is worth more than any committee recommendations." Dr. Clark was admitting that he was recommending expensive surgery that wasn't supported by medical evidence or professional guidelines, based solely on his personal opinion about what might be beneficial. But the most incriminating evidence came when I discovered that Dr. Clark had financial incentives to recommend the specific procedures he was pushing. Through research into his practice ownership and business relationships, I learned that Dr. Clark had ownership stakes in the surgical center, where he performed arthroscopic procedures, the laboratory that processed his expensive diagnostic tests, and the company that manufactured the experimental infusion therapy he'd recommended. Dr. Clark was recommending expensive procedures not because they were medically necessary, but because he received financial benefits from each test, procedure, and treatment he ordered. He was using his medical license to direct patients towards services that would profit his business interests, regardless of whether those services were actually beneficial for patient health. Armed with months of recorded consultations and evidence of Dr. Clark's financial conflicts of interest, I filed a comprehensive complaint with the Colorado Medical Board. The complaint detailed Dr. Clark's pattern of recommending unnecessary procedures, his use of fear tactics to pressure patients into expensive treatments, his financial incentives for ordering specific services, and his admission that his recommendations weren't supported by medical guidelines. I included transcripts of the recorded consultations, evidence of his business relationships with the companies providing the services he recommended, and documentation showing that his treatment recommendations were inconsistent with established medical standards. The medical board investigation moved quickly because the evidence was overwhelming and clearly documented Dr. Clark's violations of professional standards and ethical guidelines. Medical board investigators interviewed other patients and discovered that I wasn't the only one who'd been pressured into unnecessary expensive procedures. Dr. Clark had been running a systematic scheme to exploit patients with good insurance coverage by recommending profitable but medically unjustified interventions. The investigation revealed that Dr. Clark had recommended the same expensive procedures to dozens of patients who didn't meet medical criteria for those treatments, always emphasizing prevention and cutting-edge care to justify interventions that were primarily profitable for his practice. Most damaging was the discovery that Dr. Clark had been billing insurance companies for medically necessary procedures, while admitting in recorded consultations that the treatments weren't actually supported by medical guidelines. Dr. Clark was committing insurance fraud by misrepresenting the medical necessity of procedures he was recommending primarily for financial benefit. The medical board suspended Dr. Clark's license immediately pending the completion of their investigation and referred the case to law enforcement for potential criminal prosecution. But I wanted to make sure that Dr. Clark's violations were exposed to the broader medical community and that other patients were protected from his predatory practices. I contacted the local newspaper's investigative journalism team and provided them with selected portions of my evidence that could be reported without violating patient confidentiality. The resulting news story, titled "Local Doctor Suspended for Recommending Unnecessary Procedures for Profit," exposed Dr. Clark's scheme and led to dozens of other patients coming forward with similar experiences. The media coverage revealed that Dr. Clark had been targeting patients with chronic conditions and good insurance coverage, using fear tactics and exaggerated risks to pressure them into expensive procedures that primarily benefited his financial interests. Several patients shared stories of undergoing costly surgeries and treatments recommended by Dr. Clark that other physicians later determined were completely unnecessary and potentially harmful. The criminal investigation that followed resulted in Dr. Clark being charged with healthcare fraud, insurance fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud for his systematic scheme to recommend unnecessary medical procedures for financial gain. The fraud charges were based on Dr. Clark's pattern of billing insurance companies for medically necessary procedures while knowing that the treatments weren't actually indicated by medical evidence or professional guidelines. Dr. Clark tried to defend his practices by claiming that he was providing aggressive preventive care, and that his recommendations were based on his clinical experience rather than rigid adherence to guidelines. But the recorded consultations where he admitted that his recommendations weren't supported by medical evidence, combined with evidence of his financial incentives for ordering specific procedures, made it impossible for him to claim legitimate medical justification. The medical board's final ruling permanently revoked Dr. Clark's medical license and banned him from practicing medicine in Colorado or any other state. The board's decision cited gross violations of professional standards, exploitation of the doctor-patient relationship for financial gain, and systematic recommendation of medically unnecessary procedures that put patients at risk for the physician's profit. Dr. Clark was also required to pay substantial fines and restitution to patients who had undergone unnecessary procedures based on his fraudulent recommendations. The criminal case resulted in Dr. Clark pleading guilty to healthcare fraud and being sentenced to 3 years in federal prison, with additional years of probation and requirements to pay restitution to insurance companies and patients. But the consequences for Dr. Clark extended far beyond just legal penalties. His medical practice collapsed immediately when his license was revoked, leaving him with substantial business debts and no income to pay them. Dr. Clark had to sell his house, cars, and other assets to pay legal fees, fines, and restitution obligations. His reputation in the medical community was destroyed permanently, making it impossible for him to work in any healthcare-related field, even after completing his prison sentence. Most satisfyingly, the investigation led to reforms in medical practice oversight that will protect future patients from similar exploitation. The medical board implemented stronger requirements for physicians to document medical necessity for expensive procedures and created better systems for detecting patterns of unnecessary treatment recommendations. Insurance companies also strengthened their review processes for expensive procedures to identify physicians who might be recommending treatments primarily for financial rather than medical reasons. Some people have suggested that I was wrong to secretly record Dr. Clark without his knowledge, arguing that the doctor-patient relationship should be based on trust rather than surveillance. But Dr. Clark had violated that trust by recommending expensive, unnecessary procedures for his financial benefit while putting my health at risk with medically unjustified interventions. The recordings were the only way to document Dr. Clark's actual statements and motivations, since he was skilled at using medical terminology and fear tactics to make his recommendations seem legitimate when they weren't supported by evidence. Without the recorded evidence, it would have been my word against a respected physician's regarding what he'd said and how he'd justified his treatment recommendations. Dr. Clark learned that medical licenses come with ethical obligations that can't be violated for financial gain, and that some patients are too informed and too careful to be successfully exploited through unnecessary medical procedures. He also learned that healthcare fraud has serious criminal consequences beyond just professional sanctions, especially when it involves systematic exploitation of patients and insurance systems. The doctor who thought he could profit from my chronic condition by recommending unnecessary, expensive procedures ended up losing his license, his practice, and his freedom. Meanwhile, I found an excellent new rheumatologist who provides evidence-based care focused on my actual medical needs rather than profitable procedures that aren't medically justified. My new doctor was shocked when I showed him Dr. Clark's treatment recommendations and confirmed that none of the expensive procedures would have been beneficial for my condition. Sarah, you probably saved yourself from unnecessary surgery and potentially harmful treatments by questioning these recommendations, he told me. Dr. Clark's suggestions weren't just expensive, they could have actually made your condition worse. The procedures Dr. Clark wanted to perform on me would have cost over $50,000 and taken months of recovery time, all for interventions that weren't medically necessary and could have been harmful. His medical fraud scheme lasted about 2 years before being exposed. His prison sentence will last 3 years, and his loss of medical license is permanent. I think patients everywhere got the better deal when Dr. Clark was removed from practice and can no longer exploit people seeking legitimate medical care. Sometimes the best way to protect yourself and other patients is to document everything, question recommendations that don't seem medically justified, and make sure that physicians who exploit their patients face appropriate consequences. Dr. Clark got exactly what he deserved: loss of license, prison time, and permanent disgrace. And patients got what they deserved: protection from a physician who was more interested in profit than providing legitimate medical care. The doctor who tried to profit from my illness ended up losing everything he'd built through medical fraud. That's what I call perfect medical justice.